According to the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, the state is home to about 21,000 nonprofit organizations that employ more than 150,000 people. These groups provide critical services, improve quality of life, some even save lives by conducting cutting-edge medical research. But the economic recession has made it difficult for all types of nonprofits to do their jobs. A new statewide report entitled Borderline, Hope and Concern for Arizona Nonprofits took a look at the state of nonprofits in Arizona. And here with more on the study is Patrick McWhortor, President and CEO of the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits. It's good to see you here. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, Ted.
21,000 nonprofits, 150,000 folks employed, and I'm guessing, hundreds of thousands of volunteers?
Oh, absolutely. More than half of Arizonans are involved in volunteering in nonprofits, so these are organizations that are a part of all of our lives.
Indeed. And now this survey, 170 some odd nonprofits surveyed here. Who got the questionnaire?
Well, we sent this to nonprofits all over the state. We're a membership organization at the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits. We have about 600 members, which is pretty reflective and representative of the entire sector. We always make sure that we reach out to get all parts of the sector involved in the survey, so we believe that the results are reflective of the nonprofit community as a whole statewide.
I understand churches were kind of underrepresented. What was that all about?
Well, we don't have a lot of churches in our membership. They tend to have their own networks and umbrella organizations. So we have some churches, but they're about 10% of the sector, and they were a very small part of our survey.
Okay, so what was asked in this survey, and what did you find regarding the impact of the recession on nonprofits?
Well, we have been surveying nonprofits for about 4 years now on the impact of the recession on revenues, on the services provided by organizations, and ultimately on the operations and the staffing of these organizations. So we have followed the trends over 4 years, and in 2011, the trends pretty much continued that the demand for services is up, and yet revenues are down. So organizations are doing more with less each year. The good news is some of those trends moderated in 2011. Revenues were down for nearly half the organizations, but not as much as we've seen in the past 3 years.
Well, let's talk about some of the revenues here. As far as fewer than half of the nonprofits reporting revenue loss, as you mentioned, sounds like about half expect donations, though, to increase. That's somewhat optimistic there.
Well, the good news is individuals continue donating to nonprofits. Many times those are those volunteers that we talked about a moment ago. But remember that that is the smallest source of income from the community at large. The largest source of income for nonprofits is earned income. That's fees for services. You go to the museum and you pay an entrance fee. That's what we call earned income. The second largest source for nonprofits as a whole is government contracts and grants. Those have been really battered during the recession and continue to look pretty grim in the future. So really donations are strong, but that's the smallest of the three major sources of income for nonprofits.
So major funding is still a concern, and it sounds like 31%, a third of folks you talk to, expect those government sources to continue to decline.
Absolutely, and for some parts of the sector that's particularly severe. Human services organizations get about 60% of their income from government contracts and grants. State and local funding has been dropping for the last 3 years. At the federal level, they've sometimes filled that gap, but now we're seeing the federal budget put a strain on those resources. So the outlook for government resources is still quite grim.
As far as which sectors are hit harder than others, looks like arts, culture, they're hit especially hard.
Well, arts and culture was the surprise this year. They expected they were going to see some improvement. The economy is starting to show signs of improvement. They are especially dependent upon disposable income that, again, I mentioned the museum, or if you go to the symphony, or a lot of arts programs are dependent upon individual donations. So when people are donating, making those contributions, that's when they have disposable income. So they thought, well, the economy is coming back, things should be better. In fact, especially for their earned income, they saw declines as high as 25% in 2011. They were surprised by that.
Surprised by that? Any reason? Any idea as to why?
Well, we think that people are still pretty conservative with their dollars in these tight times. Families are still struggling. Even wealthier individuals maybe are not. They're putting their money away into saving instead of using to partake of the arts. So we're concerned that trend we don't want to see that continue because arts organizations are especially dependent upon that earned income and those donations.
It sounds as though strains on the nonprofit workforce seem to be easing a bit. Is that what you got from the study as well?
Yes, the fact is that the way nonprofits have done more with less for the last 4 years has put a lot of stress on their staff. They have cut positions, or they've cut hours. They certainly have frozen pay or cut pay and benefits. And that has required people to do multiple jobs. They leave positions vacant if somebody leaves. Somebody's doing 2 and 3 jobs. We are seeing a little less of that, but we asked this year if organizations are replacing positions that they cut during the recession, and a very small percentage say they're replacing those positions, and yet demand continues to rise.
I want to get to demand in a second here, but what about services suffering because of the lack of stable employment and restoring some of those jobs that were lost?
Well, the good news is that nonprofits have not laid off people to the extent in the for-profit sector. That we've seen that trend nationally as well. Now, some nonprofits in our sector tell us that's because we had very lean staff to begin. We didn't have anybody to lay off. But we are hopeful that we'll be able to see those positions start to come back to meet this continuing growing demand.
And you talk about demand a couple of times here because the demand just keeps on growing, doesn't it?
Remember, nonprofits are on the front lines of dealing with this recession, and many, many families in Arizona are still suffering the effects of the recession. You have organizations helping with foreclosure assistance, financial literacy, obviously our homeless shelters, victims of domestic violence, and on and on. These are issues that are getting worse, not better, and yet these organizations are out there trying to meet those needs with fewer resources.
I was going to say, it's very different than the private sector, isn't it? I mean, the nonprofits looks at the recession and all of a sudden demand increases. Private sector, just the opposite.
Exactly. There is a link between the private sector and the nonprofit sector because we also are partners with them. We need their support. Their employees are expecting that there be community resources for them. So we need to be partners with the business community, but they have to realize that we really struggle when we don't have the resources to be able to continue providing services.
And yet, 90% of nonprofits expect to meet demand this year.
Yes, that's the amazing thing. It is an incredibly resilient sector. Sometimes, maybe to our own peril, people say, gee, you keep doing this year after year. I guess you don't need more donations. And that's not really true. As I said, the staff are especially strained. We have a small joke, which is, if jobs start picking up in the private sector again, that'll be bad news for nonprofits because our staff will flock to this better job. So maybe it's good the economy isn't picking up. But of course, that's not really true. We want to see the economy improve.
It sounds like the underlying aspect of the whole report is fiscal stability in one way, shape, or form. Lots of deficits out there, lots of folks tapping into reserves. What's the overall picture there?
Well, we are very concerned that organizations have been tapping what are already fairly meager reserves. Over half of organizations have fewer than 4 months of operating reserves on hand, and yet that is how they're covering these deficits, how they're able to continue doing more with less. That is not sustainable. So we're seeing some indication that organizations are going to merge and consolidate or find other ways of doing working in partnership with other nonprofits, with other entities in the community, and that's probably the trend for the future. We've been a little surprised we haven't seen more examples of that. We have examples of mergers, but not as many as we might have expected. But it's very complex and time-consuming to do these mergers. So we think we may see more in the future.
The survey said half of nonprofits are committed to committing resources, I guess, to advocacy. What does that mean? And is there kind of a balancing act that needs to be done when you talk about nonprofits and advocating things?
Well, advocacy is really broadly reaching out into the community, telling your story, talking about your mission, how you make a difference in the community. It also includes public policy advocacy, so going to the legislature or to a city council or to the federal government and trying to get help on your issues there. There are some rules, of course, that nonprofits have to follow with the IRS around that, but there's a lot of room for them to do a lot of advocacy as nonprofits.
It sounds like just raising the profile of nonprofits is a major goal.
That is the most critical issue for nonprofits going forward. We also saw in our survey that 70-some% of organizations are increasing their marketing outreach efforts and their fundraising efforts, trying to get more people in the community to understand how they're meeting these vital community needs, and they need the community support in order to continue that.
Last question. Cautious optimism from this report?
Very cautious. We're still concerned about other shoes yet to drop. We mentioned arts and culture. We're very concerned about the health sector going forward. The access cuts at the state level could lead to the most significant layoffs we've yet to see in the recession. So these are still very, very dangerous times for nonprofits in Arizona.
It's good to have you here. Thanks for the information. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Thank you.